Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Narcissism Decoder, a podcast that takes a comprehensive look at the various facets of narcissism from different psychoanalytic perspectives. I'm your host, Dr. Anthony Mazzella. In today's episode, we will explore some narcissistic personality types, and in particular, we'll focus on what's commonly known as the covert narcissist, also known in psychoanalytic terms as the craving narcissist. The main goal of this episode is to address several insightful questions I received about covert narcissism. I've distilled them down into a singular, focused inquiry. In other words, the theme of the questions looks something like this. How can we foster empathy and understanding when navigating relationships with individuals who display covert narcissistic traits? And what strategies can we employ with the aim of personal growth and providing genuine emotional support to those who are affected? In conducting a thorough review of the available social media content, it became apparent that a substantial body of work predominantly addressed the descriptive aspects of covert narcissism. I won't take up too much of our time today reviewing that which is already out there, but in order to set the stage, I will say, in short, the description of the covert or craving narcissist is the individual who is or who presents as needy, clinging, demanding, pouting, whining. They are incredibly dependent, but at the same time, there's a passive aggressiveness to their behavior. So in other words, for someone who's with them, on the surface, it doesn't seem like they're doing anything that's at all aggressive, but you find yourself feeling annoyed or angry with them. When these individuals are not given to, they often lack energy to function, except they always have a lot of energy when it comes to increasing their demands in obvious but sometimes subtle ways. They're very sensitive. They're easily slighted, but at the same time, they're arrogant. And there's a sense of grandiosity, just like with all the different clusters of narcissism. But they don't come across like your typical classical grandiose narcissist. They portray themselves as either sad or anxious or overwhelmed. They're unable to think. These are the kind of individuals that when you ask them a question, the typical response is, I don't know. Or you ask them to do something and they'll say, I don't know how to do that. They need to be sought after, pulled out. They seem to function adequately at their jobs, but they collapse at home unless their partner gives them a great deal of support and attention. I find they may present as depressed, but in treatment, when given a medication, they don't really respond. In other words, the depression doesn't remit. And if someone doesn't have a response to a course of antidepressant medication, that's typically a sign that they're not depressed, that something else is going on. In social situations, they may cling to one person, or they prefer to be in small groups because they feel anxious or overwhelmed. Unlike what we call, in my field, in psychoanalytic terms, this is what's called the phallic narcissist, or this is the classic grandiose narcissist, who needs or is always the center of attention, the one who's the most brilliant, the most gregarious, the most charming. But that's not the covert narcissist. And initially, even though they seem shy and avoidant, close exploration usually reveals that they worry about how others are going to perceive them. This becomes a little easier to discern if you listen to the way they talk about not socializing. There's a sort of contemptuous disregard for other people. So if one of them, if they decide not to go to a party, they'll be contemptuous of the people at the party. Or if they go to the party, they may report, what a stupid party. Everybody there was drunk. Everybody was intoxicated. Everybody was pre-gaming and they came already stoned or high. But this, by the way, is their grandiosity. In other words, they present as if they are above all this. Within the framework of psychoanalytic terminology, these individuals make what's called a narcissistic object choice. In other words, someone is used to satisfy their own needs and desires. Family helps family, one individual told me. So they were trying to convince me and their family member, who was a mechanic, an automobile mechanic, that they should fix their car on the weekend because that's what family does, right? Family should be there for one another, so you should fix my car this weekend. Or another fellow told me, yeah, my girlfriend can drive me, right? She could pick me up and drop me off from work. Why? Because she's my girlfriend. And why should she not drop me off and pick me up? And why would I ever consider taking an Uber? So there's little ability to respect the other as a person in their own right. I highly encourage you to explore these descriptive factors further. I want to emphasize the importance of understanding these factors, as it will empower you to recognize if there's a covert narcissist in your life. Understanding the causes behind covert or the craving narcissism is essential for achieving the main goal of this episode, which is personal growth and providing genuine support to those who are affected. In my opinion, sometimes what causes this type of narcissism is the cure. So to truly grasp the cure, in other words, how do we relate to somebody like this? We need to understand the cause. But to understand the cause, we need to turn to a little bit of theory. So for now, we will focus on just one piece of one particular theory, the separation individuation process, a theory developed by Margaret Muller, a renowned psychoanalyst. And remember, this is just one theory, and every theory has limitations. And that's why it's always important to have a number of different theoretical perspectives at your fingertips. This theory primarily focused on the early stages of childhood development. So that's right, we need to go way back to understand what are the factors that lead someone to exhibit this type of behavior. This theory focused on how the infant gradually separates themselves psychologically from their primary caregiver. What they studied was the relationship between infants, toddlers, and their mother. The earliest stage of development, also referred to as the symbiotic stage, is incredibly important because it forms the foundation for the infant's sense of safety, trust, and emotional security. During this phase, the infant experiences a deep symbiotic connection with the primary caregiver, laying the groundwork for healthy attachment and the development of a strong sense of self. That's again, if things go accordingly. This is what's known as the first blissful state of development. There are two. The blissfulness of the symbiotic stage, which is longed for in later in life, provides us with a reservoir of pleasurable and creative experiences. How do infants move out of a state of unity or symbiosis? The infant undergoes a gradual process of differentiation, which results in intrapsychic structures of self and others. Even in this early stage of development, the infant and later the developing toddler is developing experiences of his or her own, especially if the caregiver is responsive to the subtle signals and signs. In other words, if there's a good match between the caregiver and the developing infant child, they begin to develop a self alone and a self with other. This is the beginnings of separation and individuation. Even this early, infants show a preference, for example, of varying amounts of stimulation. You might remember in an earlier episode, one of the causes of narcissism that was discussed had to do with having an overstimulating caregiver and the need to protect oneself through an affect block from an overstimulating caregiver. And this is where this stuff starts, very early on. If this blissful union between the caregiver and the infant, this wonderful match between them, is ruptured too quickly or is thwarted, the threat of the rupture of this narcissistic relationship, that's another word for this, and that's why I'm dwelling on this period of development, because we are talking about the craving narcissist, the infant will become dysregulated. If there's a rupture too early, or if the rupture is too abrupt that the infant, developing child, is not prepared to handle, emotionally prepared to handle, there's dysregulation. The child, later adult, may throw a tantrum. They may try to control and manipulate. I'm hoping this is beginning to sound familiar for those of you who are thinking about covert narcissism. Frustrations and disappointments due to inadequate and unempathic caretaking sets the stage for susceptibility to narcissistic wounds. These are caregivers who are distracted, uninterested, and have a lack of attunement. Maybe they are depressed. Maybe they're anxious. Maybe they're struggling with their own narcissistic issues. Maybe when they're holding the baby, they feel anxious, or that the baby is too fragile, or alternatively, they hold the baby too tight, or don't allow for a degree of separation, smothering the infant, developing child. If you listen to episode 3 of this podcast, I give a detailed example of a woman who had an invalidating caregiver. And it wasn't until some time into the treatment, as we were exploring some symptomatic bodily ailments, that she began to realize that she had an invalidating mother. If these narcissistic wounds persist into the later stages of the separation individuation process, the main task for the developing child, and later the grown adult, becomes reunion. It's a reunion of the self with the nourishing, loving caregiver. Why a reunion, you may be asking? And in part, it's because the developing child becomes aware of differentiation, separation, and is not yet emotionally ready for it. As I mentioned a moment ago, the blissful union of this early stage is ruptured too quickly, too abruptly. So this becomes the central focus of the craving narcissist adult life, this magical reunion with the all-giving caregiver, right? The all-loving, comforting caregiver. The goal is to achieve bliss and contentment characteristic of the primary narcissistic state, which implies reunion of the grandiose self. In other words, I cry out like an infant, developing child would do, and what happens? The breast appears. I'm using breast symbolically, of course, but the care, the love should appear when I cry. So there's a reunion of the grandiose self with the all-powerful, omnipotent other. Now, you may be asking, how does the narcissist go about this task of blissful reunion, which in psychoanalytic terms, it's referred to as the mode of narcissistic repair. The mode of narcissistic repair for each cluster or type of narcissism is different. The mode of repair for the craving, the covert narcissist, is that they must be fed. And they're devastated if the supplies, the nourishment, are not forthcoming. While unfed, the self-esteem suffers. Where is my specialness? He cries out. I'm hungry. Take care of me. The craving narcissist sulks, pouts, complains. And if not fed, the complaints get louder and louder and more consistent. And by the way, no work can be done to bring about the satisfaction that they're seeking. Here's a simple example. The dessert that the woman was given from her husband was spoiled because she told me that it didn't come spontaneously. She needed to ask him to get the dessert. It lost its value. What I'm saying here, though, is even if she didn't ask for him to get the dessert, there would have been another reason that the dessert was spoiled. Because they cry and they want to be fed, but they can't take in the good, gratifying feed, which leaves them quite hungry and craving. And that's the reason they're referred to in psychoanalytic terms as the craving narcissist. They are so hungry. This is the type of baby, if you could imagine this, who cries to be picked up. And then the caregiver attentively picks up the baby. And the baby begins to squirm immediately. It needs to be put down. So you put down the baby. And then the baby demands to be picked back up again. A covert narcissist behavior can be influenced by their earlier experiences with caregivers, especially if the caregiver had their own emotional struggles. Imagine a situation where a caregiver, while taking care of a child, experiences inner conflicts when the child starts to become more independent. Depending on how intense and how long lasting these conflicts are, they can impact the child's experiences in those areas of separation. Stated differently, the child might not smoothly transition through the phases of individuation. For instance, a caregiver's attachment to the child may be overly possessive, or they may feel like they need to live vicariously through the child's experiences. This type of caregiver might either distance themselves anxiously from the child, withdrawing from, instead of embracing, the child's appropriate level of dependence. Alternatively, they might excessively smother the child, overwhelm the child with too much attention and affection out of their own fears and worries about separation. Without realizing it, they are passing on their own anxiety and fear of being left alone during moments of separation. And then, of course, the child is left to carry this around into, again, if this persists, into adulthood. Fred Pine, a psychoanalyst who worked closely with Mahler, said that when the child's experiences crosses paths with the experiences that are emotionally fraught for the mother, that are full of conflict and anxiety, her handling of the infant developing child will reflect that conflict and affect the child in profound ways. It will magnify the infant's developing child's experience in ways that give it a focal, conflicted centrality. And this is a route to understanding why in some covert narcissists, issues of separation and magical reunion to the narcissistic state become lifelong disturbances and appear as interpersonal struggles when you are trying to relate to them in a meaningful way. So what I'm trying to say is there can be conflict around the merger. For instance, get me dessert, feed me, take care of me, and the dessert is spoiled. Remember the pick me up and put me down. So these are conflicts around issues regarding togetherness and aloneness. However, there are other covert, craving, narcissistic individuals where the blurring of boundaries between oneself and others is experienced blissfully instead of ambivalently, like I was just describing. This is what I referred to earlier as the blissful reunion. Remember, I mentioned the covert, all narcissists have their mode of repair, narcissistic repair. And for the covert narcissist, the blissful reunion is the mode of narcissistic repair. There's no conflict of the blurring of boundaries. So here's a simple example of this blissful reunion from an adult covert craving narcissistic individual. When she would experience separation anxiety, which, by the way, was not always easy to discern, she would collapse, feel too weak to eat, become depressed, and complain to her mother that she felt physically and emotionally drained. During these reunions, her mother assumed an exceptionally nurturing role. It went beyond the mere preparation of a meal. It actually involved the act of spoon feeding her adult daughter. This intimate act of nourishment was a poignant illustration of the mother's intense involvement and desire to care for her child, adult, by the way. And this was perhaps driven by the mother's own conflict around issues of separation. In other words, she wasn't allowing her adult daughter to separate from her. The act of spoon feeding can be interpreted as a powerful symbolic gesture. It represents a fusion of physical and emotional sustenance, with the mother taking on the role of provider and protector. Here is one more very brief example of this reunion. A patient once said to me, as we were exploring his excessive need for gratification, "I am like a little bird with an open beak, like I just want to be fed, like I'm always chirping like a bird for the mother bird to come and feed me." So there's a constant appeal for supplies. Why? They believe if they get the supplies, there will be no frustration. And if there's no frustration, there's no loss. And then if there's no loss, there's no separation. So they coerce you to act as an extension of themselves, to think for them, to take care of them. All in the service of what? To avoid this separation. Again, this is according to this one particular theory. We'll explore other theories as we go along. But in this case, it's to avoid the individuation, the separation. Let's get back to the main goal of this episode. How can we foster empathy and understanding when navigating relationships with individuals displaying covert narcissistic traits? And what strategies can we employ? Because we want to support those who are affected. So again, my theory, the theory that I subscribe to is the mechanism of cause is the mechanism of cure. Remember, I mentioned that earlier. What does that mean? Well, let's look at some of the strategies that have been suggested in the literature, and then let's compare that to a strategy that's based on a psychoanalytic theory. And there's not a one-to-one relationship, and by the way, between any theory and how we work with these individuals, how we speak to them. But we use it as a rough template. Back to the literature. So I'm looking through the social media literature content to see what is typically done to help these individuals along, or what's done to help someone in a relationship with a covert narcissist. There's an overwhelming recommendation for radical acceptance. In other words, you need to accept the covert narcissist and not have any expectations, or have realistic expectations that they're not going to change. This is who they are. And you shouldn't engage in this kind of behavior. So if they try to manipulate or coerce you in any way, don't engage. If they question you, don't explain yourself. And don't take anything personally. Don't get pulled in. Create good, healthy boundaries, and don't allow their childhood to be an excuse for their poor behavior. Being in therapy with a therapist who actually understands narcissism is absolutely essential. If you know you're in a relationship with a covert narcissist, you need to get as far away from him or her as possible, because there's nothing you could do. They're not going to change. And sometimes I've heard that there's nothing in them. There's nothing in there to be changed. It's like they're saying nobody is home. It's all just a facade. Okay, so from my perspective, I think most of these recommendations, and this is what I've heard as well, and listening and reading this literature, this content, is oftentimes creating boundaries does not work. That it's too easy to get pulled into these situations, and walking away is not always an option either. Because oftentimes people have a history. It takes some time to discover that somebody has this personality trait. And you may be invested in that relationship already. You may feel like you love this person. You may have children, financial obligations. So leaving is not always an option. It may be an option, But what I'm speaking to is somebody who really feels, like I do, that there is somebody home and that there is a potential because you feel or you sense something. There are moments of genuine responsiveness from this covert, craving narcissist in your life. You see, this idea that nobody is home has not been my experience working with these individuals. And you can call me overly optimistic or Pollyannish, but I believe that there is, borrowing a psychoanalytic term from Winnicott, another renowned psychoanalyst, that there is a true self. Yes, I understand that there is a false self in the way these narcissists present, but that also implies that there's a true self deep inside. But again, if you listen back to a few of my earlier episodes, this true self is what gets warded off. So here's a very simple example, another example of what I mean. And this goes a little bit into the tools or the strategies in helping somebody in this kind of situation. If somebody says, or a patient says to me, I feel like a nobody. There's no one inside. I feel worthless. I'm useless. That is why I can't really be with people. That's why I can't take care of things in my life, right? I just want you to give me the answer. I want everybody to tell me what to do. I'm hoping some of this sounds familiar to you. But when you ask them, if you believe, again, that there is somebody, something inside, then you would be more inclined to be curious and even more capable of talking to them in a reasonable way. So you may ask them questions. Why is it that you don't want to take responsibility for anything? Well, I don't want to be wrong, right? And I'll ask about that too. What does it mean to be wrong? I'm not sure what you mean by being wrong. Can you tell me a little bit more about that? What will happen if you're wrong? What I typically hear from these patients is that such and such a person will leave me. So what I hear is a fear of loss, a fear of getting hurt. And that's the separation. And this is where, again, there's not a one-to-one link between theory and what we see personally with these individuals in our lives. But the theory has to do with separation and individuation. And if during this process things did not go accordingly, this individual didn't develop the sense of self, the sense of autonomy that I was describing earlier. There was too early of a rupture. So now what we see is that there's a fear. And the not getting involved, emotionally involved and connected to somebody, is a way to protect something that's inside. But it's a fear that's inside. But the point is that implies that there is something in these individuals. There's a fear of venturing into relationships in a meaningful way, I mean. That would be too risky and could potentially be too painful. So there is indeed a sense of self, but a self to be protected. And on the surface, you don't see this, but it's in there. So if you can believe that someone is home, that there is a true self hidden away, you are then in a much better position to engage, to talk to somebody like this, to not feel so frustrated by their passive aggressiveness that I mentioned earlier. So this is one treatment approach. The characteristics of the covert and craving narcissist can eventually be resolved by way of beginning language and symbolic functioning. And by the way, what I mean by symbolic functioning is using language in a way that's meant to communicate something, which is virtually impossible for the craving narcissist and narcissists in general. I've heard people say approaching a conversation with a covert narcissist, or a narcissist again, just in general, is impossible. That they're not going to accept any kind of feedback that I have to offer. And what I say to those people is, don't give them feedback. In other words, giving somebody feedback is not a conversation. Let me say a little bit more about this and share my own experience. And again, this is what I see. And what I'm describing is strategies that have been helpful to me in working with individuals and couples that I treat to help them see something in terms of the way that they're behaving. So what is the goal? What is it that we want to help these individuals see? Well, if we go back to the descriptive factors, that they get involved in highly dependent, ambivalent. Remember, ambivalent is they want the meal, they want the dessert, but then they reject it for some reason. It's never good enough or quite right. So they get involved in highly ambivalent, dependent relationships, and they're never quite satisfied or capable of having their needs or expectations or desires fully met. Now, let me say that differently. Involvements have a highly ambivalent, dependent quality, since the other is never quite capable of satisfying their narcissistic needs, expectations, and demands. Now, I would never say this to somebody, but we're thinking about what is the overall message? What is it that we're working on? What do we hope to accomplish with these individuals? And we can't say this to somebody because it would be so offensive. And I'm pointing this out is because sometimes with the couples that I treat, they say to me, but I did talk to my spouse about this. And when you get very specific, it's, please, let's go over this. What exactly did you say? And what you typically hear is that they communicate to their significant other that they're demanding and that they're difficult and that there's something wrong with them. If there's something that we want to communicate to these individuals, it's far more valuable to help them come to see this on their own. In other words, the most important thing is that these people come to acquire their own insights, right? With a little bit of help, of course. So here's another simple example. Well, let me go back. Let's use an example we have already. She can drive. She's my girlfriend. Why should she not drop me off and pick me up from work? Why should I have to take an Uber? Remember that? That's the example I gave a little bit earlier. So the same thing that I had mentioned just a moment ago, the first approach, again, from my perspective, is always to remain curious. What would it be like if she didn't drive you? And this is the kind of stuff, if you can maintain an open mind and really be curious, this is the kind of stuff that you may begin to hear. It's certainly the stuff that I hear when you talk to someone about this. So what this person says is, I keep telling myself, if she really cares about me, she would do that. So you explore that a little bit further. What does this mean if she really cared? My own value and my own sense of self-worth are measured by how she does or how much of what she does that I ask of her. The main goal of this episode, I just want to remind everybody, was to address how can we foster empathy and understanding when navigating relationships with individuals displaying covert narcissistic tendencies. So here's an example. This person begins to talk about how they feel worthless, that they have no value, that they're pathetic. In other words, they feel pathetic if somebody isn't doing something for them. If you can appreciate the importance of the maladaptive symptom, it will allow you to get closer. So in other words, the symptom in this case is what? The pouting, the whining, the demanding, the coercive, manipulative behavior, right? And all that seems difficult to tolerate unless you begin to hear or think, you begin to hear things like what this fellow just told me, how worthless he feels and how important it is for him to feel an ounce of dignity that somebody is doing something for him. So if you can appreciate the subjectively useful component, I said it allows you to get closer to this. And when you can get closer to it, you can begin to understand this individual and be a bit more empathic. I'll just digress for a moment. Many years ago, when I was working on my dissertation, I worked in a hemodialysis unit. This is for individuals who have kidney failure, and they have to go to a facility and get hooked up to a machine 3 times a week for 3 to 4 hours per treatment. There were probably about maybe 8% of the population who would either skip their dialysis treatments or they would terminate them early. So as part of my dissertation, I created an intervention. It was an intervention designed to sit with these people and The goal was to increase overall adherence to the dialysis regimen. When the medical director at the facility heard about what I was doing, he said, what are you going to do? And I said, I'm going to talk to these patients. And he said, what would you talk to them about? I said, I'm going to talk to them about whatever it is that they want to discuss. In other words, I want to hear what life is like for them in terms of living a life on dialysis. And I don't know what's going to come up, but what may come up is how much they hate this, how much they hate the treatment, and they hate being here. And that's why they skip or they end their sessions early, because they can't tolerate being in this facility. So the medical director said to me, if you ever speak to any of my patients in this way, I will get you fired. So he didn't want me to use language. He didn't want me to talk to people. He didn't want me to try to help them understand why it was that they were missing or shortening their dialysis sessions. And just to finish the story, which is not too relevant to our specific topic on covert narcissism, but I did eventually go on and conduct this study. And what we found is we had a comparison group as well who got usual social work care. There was a social worker at the facility. And what we found was about a 200% improvement in the intervention group. Those were the patients who came to talk to me. So I believe that talking helps. And that's one of the things I mentioned earlier, is the goal is verbal language. The goal is symbolic functioning. The goal is to understand and help them understand, not by way of making suggestions or giving advice. And it certainly won't work if we create these rigid boundaries and we try to keep away from them, or we just try to tolerate them as if they're intolerable, which sometimes they can be, of course. I'm not blind to that. But what I'm suggesting is there's also a way we could speak to them. So from the earlier example, with somebody who says, tell me what to do so I don't have to take responsibility, what I would say is be curious. Remember, he says he doesn't want to do the wrong thing. Well, what will happen? They will leave me. And then you could feel freer to talk more about, if you can understand how terrified he is that people will leave him, now you can begin to appreciate why it's so necessary for him to coerce other people to whine and complain. A little bit of manipulation too. Present yourself as pathetic or depressed, right? In order to get other people to do things for him. Because if they're doing things for him, they love him. And that's his promissory note that they're not going to leave him. So this stuff becomes a little bit easier to say to him then, from an empathic point of view, that I understand now why it's so important for you to sort of put pressure on her to drive you back and forth to work, because that's the proof that she loves you. Unfortunately, we have to leave it here for now. There's so much more to say, but we're running short on time. If you would like to hear more strategies about tact or timing, or how to frame a productive conversation, or even how to develop the symbolic functioning, because that, I believe, is intimately connected with the lessening of the main goal, right? What's the main goal of the covert craving narcissist? The main goal is the magical, blissful reunion. If you have any questions or want to dive deeper into any of the topics you heard today, feel free to shoot me an email. I would be delighted to hear from you. Until next time, engage your mind. Disclaimer alert. The Narcissism Decoder podcast is provided for general information purposes only. The content presented in this podcast is not intended to diagnose, treat, or cure any psychological condition related to narcissism. The content on this podcast should not be considered a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. For specific advice pertaining to narcissism or any other psychological condition, you could reach me directly. I am an experienced mental health practitioner who is always taking on new patients. If you would just like a consultation, I can do that too.